Are you curious about bodies, pleasure, and possibilities? And what about curious about what others are up to on the planet when it comes to pleasure, sex, and play? Have you considered what pleasure can do for your life, your body, and your bank account? Do you know something magical, delightful, and out of this world orgasmic is not only possible for you, but totally available to you? If you're ready to be the magical, sexual, sexy beast you know you can be, and you just need the tools to get there, you're in the right place. Now, here is the host of The Pleasure Zone, sex, relationship, and intimacy coach and holistic health practitioner, Milica Jelenic.
Welcome, my sweet pleasure seekers. For those of you who are joining tonight, and you might have seen the title of the show and went, well, that's not sexy. The thing is, in order to get to that place where we can feel sexy, sometimes we got to look at the stuff that isn't so sexy, like the traumas and the different things that have maybe impacted what's going on in your life. And sometimes you could be going through your life for decades even, and you think, oh, everything's good, and I don't have any sexual dysfunction, and life is good. And then out of nowhere, something occurs, and all of a sudden, your body isn't reacting the same, and things are changing, and you're wondering what's going on. And first, you might chalk it up to maybe I'm going through andropause, maybe I'm going through menopause, maybe it's postpartum depression. We'll often find different things, excuses. We'll try and really hone it in on to there must be a physiological thing going on, a biochemical thing going on. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes the biochemistry is happening, yes, that those hormones are off, but there's an underlying reason for it. And sometimes it's things that we've chosen to ignore for a very long time. And those things that tend to get ignored for a very long time are the things of shame and guilt and all these other feelings that are often quite a big part of what happens if you've ever experienced sexual trauma of any kind. And we're going to get into kind of that as well. How do you define sexual trauma? It's pretty vast. There's a lot to uncover there. Then we're going to also look at, so we'll look at that. We'll look at how this has affected your bodies, the nervous system, and everything else that, as a result of that, what else can be going off. And then we're going to look at some solutions. So in this first segment, and I want to put a fair warning out there for people to let you know if you're feeling sensitive to this kind of information, if you have experienced any sexual trauma of any kind, and you're finding this this topic is just not, you're not ready for it, maybe skip ahead if you want, maybe to the second or third section to find out how your nervous system has been affected, maybe to the third segment where you're going to find some solutions. So I'm going to do this segmentally so that those of you listening, if you want to be able to just skip ahead, you can do that. And if you want to come back to this first section where I'm going to dive into what are some of the main different things that are listed under sexual traumas. That way you'll know if you've ever experienced it. I think a lot of people don't even realize it, or maybe they've brushed it aside. Maybe they've put it so far hidden into the recesses of their mind that they forgot that it's happened. And this is for all genders, all sexes, because this is not something that's just women, or it in any particular way. There's lots of men who have also experienced this. There's also a lot of sexual trauma that occurs when people have different identities, gender-wise as well. So I'm going to generalize it to people experiencing these things. So before we dive in, you might want to know, why am I even talking about this? Who am I and why am I qualified? So are any of us qualified, really, truly? Probably not, even if you have a degree in it, because can any of us ever truly understand what another human being has gone through, even if we've gone through something similar. Probably not. Even if you were in the same room with the same with somebody who experienced something that you experienced, you might have interpreted it or experienced it in a different way. So I don't know that we can ever truly understand each other's experiences. However, if you're even slightly empathic or compassionate, you might be able to understand what somebody has suffered through. So what qualifies me is that I'm a holistic health practitioner. I have been for over almost 28 years. I'm also a sex and intimacy coach as well as a relationship coach. And one of the things that I love to focus on is helping people get out of trauma and into pleasure. And whether that's physical trauma from a car accident and showing them different methods in order to get their body back on track, if it's been trauma from different other experiences in their life where maybe they felt neglect or anything like that, and their body is affected as a result. We have traumas all the time. We have stresses to the point where our bodies are overwhelmed all the time as well. There are differences in that. Today, we are specifically talking about sexual trauma. And I'm not going to get graphic, guys. Oh, I hope I don't get graphic. I don't plan, let me put it this way, I don't plan to get graphic, but if I do get graphic, it's going to be in the first segment when I am describing different sexual traumas. I may tap into my own personal story, but I think you guys have heard it a lot. So if you're an avid listener, you've already heard what I went through. If you are not an avid listener, then there are episodes where I've talked about that. So we today are going to look at what are some of the things that, if you're wondering, have I ever experienced this in your own life, then here are some things to be aware of. Also, be aware too that while if you are listening to the whole show, that if some things are triggering for you, just, the lucky thing is, unless you're listening to it while this is going live, you can always just walk away, right? Come back to it later when it's gone into recording. If you're listening it on recording, you can always pause and come back, right? So do self-care while you're listening to this episode, particularly anytime I'm talking about trauma. I think it's really good for you to just be able to take care of yourselves, or anytime you're watching something that triggers you, remember to pause and take care of yourself, because overcoming sexual trauma is a really big thing to experience in life. This is not a little topic. This is a big topic. And until we have some tools under our belt, you'll find that sexual trauma is going to invade your life in different ways. It's going to affect your work. It's going to affect your relationships, even with friends. It affects things in ways that you don't even necessarily realize at the time. It may bring you into friendships or relationships or take you out of them that, had been supportive, but maybe your trust levels are off. You're not really sure anymore about people. So there's a lot of things that can be occurring. So we're going to get into looking at what some of the more common experiences of sexual trauma are. We're also going to look at how trauma affects the nervous system, the brain, the body, all of that. And then we're going to look at some ways to be able to get onto the healing path. So these are maybe going to be just like fair warning, fair warning, fair warning. I can't do enough fair warning on this. So the first thing I think we need to look at is some of the most obvious ones, right? Well, I think they're all, I think for some people, maybe they're all obvious, but let's go with the wide description that sexual trauma is basically any experience that involves non-consensual, coercive, it can be abusive, it can also be psychological, emotional, or physical distress in a sexual way. And it can occur at any age. It can be a one-time thing. It can be something that has happened multiple times It can happen with multiple people. It's not like a competition. I've heard people go, oh, that only happened like once, so it's like no big deal. I'm like, rape happened once. Yeah, that is a big deal. So your body, you can try and be brushing it away for the rest of your life, but unless you have done some things to get the trauma out, the chances are your body is still affected by it. So let's start with sexual abuse, which is loosely defined as any unwanted sexual activity that's forced on a person, like manipulation, threats, and force. And usually, sexual abuse is usually quite common and unfortunately common in childhood. It can't, adulthood as well, but you find that there's a lot of coercion and manipulation, especially with young children who don't know what's happening. And then the threats that come, like if you ever tell, you know, your mom or your dad about this, then, never, you're going to be in trouble. And, sometimes people will be like, well, if you ever say anything, I'm going to go to jail. And like, then you're guilty somehow for their action. It's messy. And a lot of times, perpetrators, but not always, a lot of times, though, perpetrators are people that the children know. And even with in adulthood, you'll probably find that there's a lot of times that it's people could be family members, authority figures, acquaintances, even strangers. But there's a report in the US over the last year or two where the number one people who are being arrested for sexual abuse, so human trafficking is under there as well, sexual assault, all those kinds of sexual violations. There were over 800, I think it was 800 people arrested with multiple counts of abuse, and most fall under the category of white male heterosexual. So you can look at the stats on that for yourself. I know that that's probably going to offend a lot of people. There are statistics out there, you can look at them. So that's statistics for the United States. I'm sure if you go to other countries, you're going to find that it's more in the adult male category as well. Not to say that women are not abusers, sexual abusers. Absolutely, that happens. So I think it's just something like if you really don't believe the stats, go check them out. A lot of times it is authority figures that kids trust, and then that is where the main problems go. I might be talking about this into the second segment as well. So the third and fourth segment will be about other things, but I want to make sure that we cover all the different kinds of trauma so that people don't just brush it off as if it was nothing. So sexual assault as well, which would be any non-consensual sexual contact, including things like rape, penetrative sexual assault, forced oral sex or other sexual acts, groping or unwanted physical touch, being forced to perform sexual acts on another person. So those are some of the things under sexual assault. Coercion and manipulation. Those are so common that it's like, it's vomit how common the coercion and manipulation are. So for quite a long time, I thought, oh yeah, I only had like the one occurrence in my life. And then I started to really look at like what falls under the category of sexual trauma. And I realized how many times there was coercion and manipulation involved. And I was like, how did that show up in my life so much? So emotional or psychological pressure to engage in unwanted sexual activity. I won't even get into too many details on that. That one, I can't even tell you. I couldn't even probably count on all my fingers and toes how many times I experienced that. Things like threats and blackmail and guilt tripping. Oh yeah, to obtain consent. That was for a good probably 9 or 10 years of my life. I experienced that on a regular basis. And what a relief to my nervous system when that stopped. And I met my husband, and my nervous system could calm down. So, wow. So, there's also coercion and manipulation can also be something called, like, there's a term called stealthing, where somebody can remove condom without consent. And then, all kinds of things can occur, like STIs and pregnancies, and that absolutely not okay. Also sexual harassment that leads to fear or pressure or distress. And the part about this consent and doing all these things to create consent, that also there can be some mixed things going on, like sexual abuse with somebody who cannot give consent, who's either not able to verbally consent or even do sign language to consent, or even blink their eyes to consent. It could be somebody in a coma, and they don't even maybe even know that that happened. So there's that can occur. There's also, if you ever watched Kill Bill, there was a scene in Kill Bill where the main character is being sexually violated all the time while she's in a coma. And yeah, so that does happen. That absolutely does happen. So there's that mix of not being able to give consent, that just keeps going on. Also, age of consent with, child sexual abuse. There's no age. The person is not of age. I'm trying to stay on track and not like jump into my own history a lot. So we're going to go to commercial, and then I'm going to come back. I'm going to list some more things that fall under the categories of sexual trauma, and then we're going to look at how that's affected your body, and then what we can do to heal and move forward. So you're listening to the Pleasure Zone here on Inspired Choices Network, and I'll be right back after this commercial.
Are you secretly a voyeur, wondering what's going on in other people's sex lives? What if now is the time for a totally different sexual evolution? Are you interested in people who are pioneers of different sexual and pleasurable practices? Lean in now with Milica Jelenic, where she will entice you and your body to know your own pleasure zone. On the Pleasure Zone radio show, with sex, relationship, and intimacy coach, Milica Jelenic, you'll receive tools, inspiration, and a foundation to allow yourself to receive more in your sex life, and quite possibly other areas of your life as well. Listen for the Pleasure Zone with Milica every Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Central Time, 6 p.m. Mountain Time, and 5 p.m. Pacific Time on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com.
Are you a subject matter expert? Are you here to share your expertise with an audience waiting to hear from you in only the way you can deliver? Are you ready to have your voice amplified across the airwaves? Inspired Choices Network has a global radio platform streaming to millions of people across the world. Professionally produced and supported by an accomplished team every step of the way, you can broadcast from anywhere in the world, knowing your voice matters, and we ensure it is delivered with ease and efficiency. Eager to hear your message, the world awaits. Contact us today to become an Inspired Choices Network radio host. Email become a host at inspiredchoicesnetwork.com.
This is the Pleasure Zone with sex, relationship, and intimacy coach, Milica Jelenic. To participate in the program today, join our live studio audience in our chat room at inspiredchoicesnetwork.com. You can also make the choice to ask or comment by email, info@milicajelenic.com. Now, back to the program.
Well, welcome, my sweet pleasure seekers. Today's episode is not for the faint of heart. It is about overcoming sexual trauma. And one of the things we need to look at first is, what are some of the definitions of sexual trauma? What defines that? How do you know if you've experienced it? And as you listen to this in the last segment, you might even be listening and going, oh, I didn't even realize things like manipulation and coercion, how maybe that's occurred in your life, and you didn't even realize how often it occurred. I know for me, that one was like, this is probably, actually, I'd been doing this pleasure zone already. And I think it was during research that I was like, whoa, I didn't even realize that would even count, I guess. And as you start to realize it, it's one of those things when you start to realize what's going on in your life and you're like, whoa, yeah, so that happened. And then luckily I have lots of people that I also uh, rely on as my coaches and my team to help me through things. So I think one of the things that can happen if you don't have that is that you can get really bogged down and then you can get really lonely. So if you are going through healing of any kind and you're trying to do it solo, it's not that easy. You can try, but it's definitely helpful to even have sounding boards and have somebody that you can work with in order to give you guidance or even just be an ear for you. So if you need somebody like that, you can always connect with me at milicajelenic.com. Happy to be there to be your sounding board or even to work with you to give you tools. Also working with some of the tools we'll be talking about in this episode as well. So one of the last things we talked about before going to break was about manipulation and coercion, which happens whether you're in a short-term or a long-term relationship. And one of the things is that I worked with a woman for many, many years who, not as her therapist, we worked together in like a company, and she experienced coercion on a regular basis, and I remember pointing it out to her that even though you're married doesn't mean that you have to do this. So this also falls into the category of intimate partner sexual violence. So whether that's marriage or long-term relationship, it's somebody that you've been in a relationship with, and there's forced sex, there's coercion, there are sex acts that are non-consensual, which is different than consensual non-consent, which is more playful and kinky. We're talking about non-consensual, period. And that is not okay. So there is a total misunderstanding, and I hear it all the time, that somehow there's this obligation that if you're married or you're in a long-term loving relationship, that the person that you're with is obligated to have sex with you. They are not. Even if you've been in a long-term relationship, they are not. There is no obligation at any point to have sex with anybody ever. So even though you might not feel like you have choice, know that if you're not feeling like you have choice, there's an issue going on. If you know you have choice, fantastic. If you feel like you don't have choice, that is when you know there's a problem. So if you've been experiencing anything like feeling like you have to have sex, but you don't really want to, and I hear reports about this from both men and women, so it's not just a one-way thing where men are the ones forcing it on their wives and vice versa. It happens both ways, where partners will feel like obligation sex, and obligation sex is the worst. It is not, doesn't feel consensual, and it is not fun. It is, ugh. I did an entire episode on obligation sex, so go back and listen to that if you want to hear my take on that. So other ways that sexual trauma can occur is through sex trafficking, which we're hearing more and more and more about. Lots of things being uncovered in the human trafficking, sex trafficking world in the last 10 to 15 years. There are organizations out there going in to rescue people. There's an organization called the Underground Railroad. I believe they're still called the Underground Railroad. Yeah, they are helping people get out of sex trafficking, and what they have a really you can send donations to them to help them run their organization, because it's all through donations, and they're not asking me to tell you this. And I think they're still in business. I'll have to check. I have mentioned them in shows in the past. And they have rescued many people. One of the things that did come up in a few of the stories that I read from from their work is that oftentimes the exploitation has been so ongoing for so long that even when the people get out and they're attempting to be rehabilitated, they don't know how to survive in the world without exploitation, and they often land themselves back into it. So this is vicious, terrible cycle that can occur. And well, I feel for people who are going through that. It's yeah, I don't know how long or how much work it would take to have your nervous systems regulated for you to have trust again. But I do have faith and know that it is possible. So if you are somebody who's gone through that, definitely get yourself into some kind of form of rehabilitation. There are experts who work with people who have been trafficked. Um, they specialize in that form of therapy. So I would go to somebody that specializes in that. Absolutely. And if you need help finding them, I'm happy to help you find resources for that. That is not something I'm trained in, but I do know people who are. So happy to assist with that. So, sex trafficking can occur. Like one of the stories I read, sex trafficking was a mother having her children be sex trafficked from a very young age. She was making money off of it. Sometimes there's, people making child porn or all kinds of things. It's friggin' disgusting, to say the least. So there's also all kinds of things like sometimes exploitation can be where, maybe you thought you were with somebody you loved and they coerced you into, or you agreed to making like a sex video or something, and then they are putting it out in the world and using it as a manipulation to get money from you or uh, revenge on you, or yeah, there's so many ways. There's also online sexual coercion these days is pretty huge, or grooming, or any of those ways that you're finding that people are, you might find like young teenagers who are feeling lonely or getting online, and people are in like even just regular things like Instagram, talking to young kids and just trying to convince them into sending pictures, and then those pictures are getting sent around all over the place. It's just gross. So exploitation and trafficking. If I had all the money in the world, I would probably give 95% of it to stop exploitation and trafficking, and the other 5% to get everybody food. So that's because once you get out of the trafficking and once you get out of the trauma of that, you're much more able to survive and have a healthy life. So the food is just a bonus. So survival sex is another one. Sometimes people will have survival sex because you got to have the money to be able to, it's like you might have sex with somebody to get the $50 you need in order to pay your bills. That is really common, and one of probably the original ways that a lot of women started businesses. I wouldn't say it's the first and only way, because probably gardening, food and food stuff, farming was probably one of the very first careers ever, but or sewing clothes or something like that. But you often talk about prostitution in that way. Now there are prostitutes who absolutely choose to be in prostitution, and then there's exploitation and having sex for survival. So we're gonna jump through because I have a lot on this list. Where there's also child sexual trauma, which we talked a little bit about. And that's sexual trauma under the legal age, right? So whether it's being inappropriately touched, having inappropriate exposure, online exploitation, child pornography, being forced to create pornography, being forced to watch pornography. There's like definitely long-term psychological effects that occur because of that. And I know way too many people who have gone through childhood sexual abuse, way too many. I don't even, I think if I actually look through my files of people I've worked with, I would say that the number is like 1 in 2. Probably 1 in 2 people that I know out of men and women who have experienced it on some level. We've got sexual trauma in medical institutions. So whether that's through doctors, medical professionals, there was a slew of things going on with some dentists locally for a while. And I think that guy got arrested. There's also religious or institutional abuse that goes on in schools and churches, different organizational settings. Like I think there was also a whole bunch of people in scouts. It's hard to figure out where can you send your kids for your kids to be safe. It's really hard to know. So you got to kind of learn to trust learn to trust your child, learn to be there for them whenever they call you, if they need to be rescued, all of that sort of thing. So there's also, a lot of times there's a power dynamic going on where somebody's either in a position of authority. Usually it's a position of authority, like a medical professional or a priest or something like that, where you don't feel like you have the right to say no. So that's very problematic. And then there's also kinds of non-physical sexual trauma, like being forced to watch pornography against one's will. Verbal sexual harassment, like threats or online sexual abuse, that does happen too. There's also sexual humiliation or degradation, like non-consensual BDSM play. So all BDSM needs to be consensual. There's also like things like slut shaming that can be a form of non-physical sexual trauma. So there's a lot of them, right? I'm sure that looking and hearing that list, you might go, holy cows, like, yes, that has occurred to either yourself or to somebody you know. I bet in that list, at least one person, probably more like 10, who maybe even including yourself, who have gone through one of those 8 main categories I was just talking about. So when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the effects of sexual trauma, how that's affected your nervous system and your body and all of that. And then we're going to talk about some solutions. So you're listening to The Pleasure Zone here on Inspired Choices Network, and we'll be right back after this commercial.
Are you secretly a voyeur, wondering what's going on in other people's sex lives? What if now is the time for a totally different sexual evolution? Are you interested in people who are pioneers of different sexual and pleasurable practices? Lean in now with Milica Jelenic, where she will entice you and your body to know your own pleasure zone. On the Pleasure Zone radio show, with sex, relationship, and intimacy coach, Milica Jelenic, you'll receive tools, inspiration, and a foundation to allow yourself to receive more in your sex life, and quite possibly other areas of your life as well. Listen for The Pleasure Zone with Milica every Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Central Time, 6 p.m. Mountain Time, and 5 p.m. Pacific Time on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com.
How wonderful would it be to carry your favorite Inspired Choices Network host with you throughout your day? Well, now you can. Inspired Choices Network now has its very own mobile app. Our free app offers live streaming shows, along with thousands of podcasts and TV episodes. Our shows cover a wide variety of topics. Whether you're waking up with us, carrying us through the day, and taking us to bed with you, we're always here for you to enjoy. We're easy to find. Just search for Inspired Choices Network in the Apple App Store or Google Play Store.
This is The Pleasure Zone with sex, relationship, and intimacy coach, Milica Jelenic. To participate in the program today, join our live studio audience in our chat room at InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. You can also make the choice to ask or comment by email, info@MilicaJelenic.com. Now, back to the program.
Welcome back, my sweet pleasure seekers. And for those of you who are sticking through this and you just listened to the last 2 segments, which have been all about the different, like me basically listing different kinds of sexual traumas, kudos to you. And if you have listened to all of those, and thank your lucky stars that you didn't experience any of them, I am so happy for you. If you did listen to all of them and you had some awakening aha moments and went, holy smokes, I actually experienced A, B, C, and D, then, and you don't really know what to do with that information and you need to talk about it, you can always book a time with me. Go to my website, milicajelenic.com. For this particular episode, if you reference it, I will gift you half an hour for free. So, oh yeah, so what I want to get to is, how do all of these things in like a generalized way, how does sexual trauma affect your nervous system? So when you experience trauma of any kind, but we're going to say specifically today about sexual trauma, it affects your autonomic nervous system, or short is ANS. And it reacts in the four main, I think there's more now that are being listed, but the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And if we break that down, when it comes to any kind of sexual trauma, it could be fight is when you're trying to fight back, maybe pushing or yelling. You might even be screaming no. You might be crying even. You might be fighting in different ways. I'll give you an example of one that I did. I bit somebody's face once that tried to do something. But sometimes you get overpowered and there are too many people involved, which was another scenario I was in. And then you might just flight, like you might actually try to flee the situation. So that's one. But sometimes if there are too many people involved, you might just freeze. You might feel immobilized. You might feel completely disconnected. And you might actually feel like you're floating above your body, watching the whole thing as if it was like a weird scene in a movie from a really weird camera angle, and you're like watching everything happening and you can't do anything about it. And then, people will be like, well, you didn't do anything, so, you must have liked it. Well, no, your body has actually shut down and you don't respond. And the thing about that is, and then we have fawn, which is even more awkward at times, because you might try to appease the person or comply just so that things won't be as bad. That's when you might get stuck in that people pleasing effect. So it's like you might be you might be saying no, and then the person starts doing something to you, your body. And we've talked about this before, the body sometimes responds because the body gets stimulated. However, that doesn't mean that you have consented. And if you specifically didn't consent and somebody keeps proceeding to do things to you, and your body then has a physiological response because it can't help it, a physiological response does not equal consent. And for a very long time in courts, they would, deny that that was the case. I think now that there's more evidence from sex researchers that bodies can be sexually stimulated without consent, or can just pressure, whether you want it or not, can create a reaction in the body. I think they're starting to realize that yes, rape can occur even if the person's body might have what looks like a pleasure response. There, that fine line between pain and pleasure, or the resistance reaction kind of stuff, is so unclear. So how you get clarity is that if you know that you didn't want it, and whether you said it or, sometimes you can't say it, maybe your mouth was gagged so you couldn't say anything, and you tried to fight back and you couldn't. So what are you going to do? I'm not going to put out too many scenarios because I don't want people to get too visual and maybe get too triggered by those thoughts. So if you have had that fight response where you wanted to fight back, if, pushing, yelling, saying no, maybe even biting their face like I did, maybe there was flight involved, maybe you were able to escape the situation. Maybe you froze like I have done before as well, and you just become immobilized and you feel nothing, you feel disconnected, and you literally sometimes can feel like you're watching from above. And fawning, where you just attempt to appease them so that you don't get hurt. I've been in 3 of those. I haven't had the flight situation so great because I'm not very good at running away. So if your trauma has not been fully processed, which is not an easy thing to do, fully process it, then what happens is your nervous system will get stuck in those survival responses, sometimes in many of those responses, and it'll flip back and forth. And it will lead to things like long-term dysregulation. And one of the ways you can have long-term dysregulation is, like, for example, if your body is on sympathetic nervous system overload, hyperarousal, for example, you might end up with chronic anxiety or panic attacks. You might have hypervigilance. You might have sleep disturbances like insomnia or difficulty feeling safe. You might have heightened sensitivity to touch or sound or movement. So sympathetic nervous system overload is hyperarousal, always feeling like there's too much happening. That hypervigilance is really, really high. Then we have hypoarousal, which is the dorsal vagal shutdown, so nervous system collapse. And sometimes what that leads to is things like disassociation, where you feel numb or detached from reality. You might feel emotional flatness. So sometimes you feel like loss of joy, loss of any, like just loss of experience, expression, loss of emotions in general. You might feel exhausted, fatigue. You might notice that your libido just disappears, or you start to have sexual dysfunction as the body doesn't really want to have sex. So trauma gets stored in the body, and when the body has stored trauma in it, it will create things like chronic pain, whether it's chronic pain in your pelvis or headaches or muscle tension. You might think your whole life you're like, oh, well, maybe it's my aging, or I have this, or maybe I have fibromyalgia. But if you have some things that are chronic conditions and the doctor has no solution for you, go to somebody who is a trauma-informed body worker, trauma-informed therapist, like who does EMDR or somatic body work, because your body will start to tell you what is creating all of that chronic pain. You might even find that you end up with digestive issues like IBS or nausea, or the gut-brain dysfunction where you get like fog brain, and then your brain doesn't work and your guts don't work, and all of that gets kicked off. It can lead to, because your body is in either hypoarousal or hyperarousal, it can lead to autoimmune conditions. It can lead to chronic inflammation. It can lead to a lot of things that are unexplained medical symptoms that they're like, we don't know why this is happening. All your tests show up as normal. Well, chances are there is trauma that has been stored in your body, and your body is now affected by it. So those are somatic effects. Soma means body. So somatic effects are body effects of the body. And it also, it'll have impacts in other ways as well. Like it'll impact your relationships, like even down to friendships. Friendships and family relationships, especially if family was involved. A lot of times you'll see family siding with the perpetrator, which is mind-boggling, but families will side with the perpetrator, and it will be sort of assumed that everything's okay. It's okay, Uncle, I don't know, we'll give him a name, Bob. Uncle Bob is, it's just Uncle Bob, it's just what he's done. It's what and he's probably sexually abused every child in the whole family. But it's, they just brush it off as, we don't want to make any waves, so we're just gonna let Uncle Bob do whatever he wants. That happens. And then so it can destroy families, absolutely. It can destroy relationships. It can destroy your trust in the people that you thought you could trust. It can do a lot. It can, friendships and can be lost as well. And then there's the impact on other parts, right, of your relationships. So fear of intimacy, fear of physical touch in general, like maybe being touched, because you're more hypersensitive, any kind of touch might throw you off. And having somebody who's an incredibly good lover, and in the way that I mean good is that they ask you, they communicate, they understand consent, communication, and curiosity. So they're willing to try new things that you're comfortable with. They're willing to talk with you about what's going on, how your body's responding, and they know consent is number one. Those are your good lovers. I don't care what skill set he or she has or they have in the bedroom. If they can give you 500 orgasms, I don't care about that. Do they have consent, communication, and curiosity? That makes them an excellent lover. Skills are easy to build on, but those fundamentals, if you don't have those three fundamentals of consent, curiosity, and communication, you actually have a fundamentally flawed sex life. So you need those, absolutely need those. So the trust can go away. Trusting partners, trusting anybody. There's feelings of guilt and shame, and sometimes you don't even want to even be in your body, so it's hard to even be present in your body to enjoy anything. You might just avoid all sexual activity, or you might become hypersexual as a coping mechanism, which was one of the things I did. I became hypersexual to try and regulate my nervous system, but also to try and be empowered as if I was in control. And it took me a while to realize that that wasn't functioning. So, definitely having good therapists helped me a lot, and having different kinds of therapy. And some of this therapy was body work that is somatic, which I now do with people. So we're going to talk about some of the healing, how to heal the nervous system after sexual trauma. We're going to talk about that in this next segment before the show ends. So you're listening to The Pleasure Zone here on Inspired Choices Network, and we'll be right back after this commercial.
Are you secretly a voyeur, wondering what's going on in other people's sex lives? What if now is the time for a totally different sexual evolution? Are you interested in people who are pioneers of different sexual and pleasurable practices? Lean in now with Milica Jelenic, where she will entice you and your body to know your own pleasure zone. On the Pleasure Zone radio show, with sex, relationship, and intimacy coach, Milica Jelenic, you'll receive tools, inspiration, and a foundation to allow yourself to receive more in your sex life, and quite possibly other areas of your life as well. Listen for The Pleasure Zone with Milica every Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Central Time, 6 p.m. Mountain Time, and 5 p.m. Pacific Time on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. This is The Pleasure Zone with sex, relationship, and intimacy coach, Milica Jelenic. To participate in the program today, join our live studio audience in our chat room at InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. You can also make the choice to ask or comment by email, info@MilicaJelenic.com. Now, back to the program.
Welcome back, my sweet pleasure seekers. We have been talking about being able to overcome sexual trauma. And one of the things we talked about in the first two segments are definitions of what sexual trauma is, different categories. We could say there's probably more. There's kind of 8 main ones. And then we talked also about how your body responds, how the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, your autonomic nervous system, how that kicks in, how that affects things like if your body is hyper activated or hypoactivated, then it's going to do different things, whether you're going to be in anxiety or you're going to be in depression. What you really want to do is learn how to get your body to be connected and feel like you're in your body, so you're present, connected, and that you're able to create community so you can relate to other people, that you can have curiosity again and play. Those are all really important. I'm a really big fan of trying all kinds of therapies to see what works for you. What I'm really a fan of is that all the work that you are doing would be related to being able to rewire your nervous system. so that your body can feel safe. And what does that mean? Feeling safe to me, and it could mean something different to you. So question that. What does it mean to feel safe? And if you're like, I have no idea, it might be a good indicator that you've never felt safe. So what does safe mean to you? And for me, safe means that I'm actually in a place where I feel that I can have conversations and not be judged. I can have and do things in my home where I have a sense of freedom. Even outside of my home, I might have a sense of freedom. I know I'm safe in my relationship when I can have a conversation with my husband about something that might scare me, that I normally would have thought somebody would walk away from me because I said something that maybe would be triggering or whatever it is. And that, we're able to be adults, sit down and have a conversation. So I don't feel abandoned. That's really important to me, is to not feel abandoned, so that I don't fall into my category. So I can feel securely attached rather than feeling anxious attachment, right? So getting to a place out of anxious attachment into a feeling of secure attachment, being able to feel present and connected. So some of those methods are somatic therapy, which can include body-based work, like the work that I do, also breath work, movement of any kind, which is another kind of somatic work that I do, is movement work, and touch therapy. That's another kind of somatic work that I do as well. I really love somatic work. So those are some of my favorites. And within the somatic work, there are polyvagal exercises that I teach people. So those are ones that polyvagal exercises are anything that stimulates the vagus nerve to shift from fight or flight to relaxation. And so yoga falls under that category, along with Pilates. There's a lot of different work that is polyvagal, not that they label it that way, but it actually is. It'll help your body shift from fight or flight to relaxation. There's also mindfulness and grounding practices. So breath work, meditation, sensory awareness, a lot of things like even writing down your experiences. That's part of mindful practice, is being able to either you can journal what you're experiencing, get that out of your system. Sometimes people like to, with mindful practices too, be able to do little ceremonies to let things go. And then you can start to do things by slowly reintroducing different kinds of pleasure and intimacy. So you can do that for yourself first. So learning what parts of your body you feel okay with touching. Dance is great. Dance therapy, I've done that as well, which is a lot of fun. And doing things that are just simple self-care, like taking yourself to get a pedicure, or going and getting, a professional barber to do your mustache or something. Like, there's simple self-care. Bathing is like number one, I think, for self-care, and sleep. Those two are really important for self-care. And then also looking at things like different kinds of therapeutic support, whether it's trauma-informed coaching or different kinds of therapy. EMDR, fantastic. I'm currently learning a kind of work called family constellations, which is also fantastic for trauma. So, and so there's also play therapy. There is, guys, there's so much available. One of the things I'd encourage you to do is, if this is something that speaks to your heart, or if you're somebody who's experienced this and you want to know more, and you like, listening to I love audiobooks, but you can buy this book called The Body Keeps the Score. And The Body Keeps the Score it's a pretty heavy read. It has a lot of references to things like different studies, and there's, I think it's one of the best books out there because it's so all encompassing on how to heal trauma, that it'll give you a lot of ideas on things you can do. It'll give you ideas on how far we've come in the last 50 years when it comes to trauma, because boy, 50 years ago, we didn't have this information in the same way. Thank you for listening, guys.
Thank you for choosing to
Have a great
listen
night.
to The Pleasure Zone with sex, relationship, and intimacy coach, Milica Jelenic. We'll return next Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Mountain Time, and 5 p.m. Pacific on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. We hope you'll join us. Until then, have the best week of your life by choosing to be turned on and tuned in to your body.